A single fighter pilot finds himself surrounded by 9 enemy aircraft. His engine is sputtering. His fellow pilots are either scattered across the sky or already dead. Every rule in the book says he should climb higher, regroup with survivors, and get out of there. But he does the opposite. He shoves his control stick forward and plunges directly into the middle of all 9 German planes at speeds that should tear his aircraft apart. What unfolds over the next 4 minutes will transform how fighter pilots wage war for generations to come. The year is 1942, and spring has arrived in the skies above northern France. The German Air Force owned the skies over France in those days. British pilots flew their patrols in tight, orderly formations, following combat manuals written during peacetime by officers who had never faced a Messerschmitt screaming toward them at 400 miles per hour. These strategies looked perfect on paper. They were organized, professional, and completely predictable, and they were getting young pilots killed faster than flight schools could train replacements. Fighter command was hemorrhaging men. Every mission over enemy territory was a gamble with death. The Spitfires themselves were extraordinary machines, but the pilots inside them had been trained to fight according to outdated thinking. They would ascend into swirling aerial battles. They would engage the enemy with textbook precision, and they would be shot down, one after another, with grim regularity. The Germans had figured out the pattern completely. Whenever British planes appeared on the horizon, the Messerschmitt 109s would gain altitude and tempt the Spitfires into turning dogfights. Then the Focke-Wulf fighters would come screaming down from even higher, dropping on the British like rocks from a cliff. It was all about angles and physics. It was entirely foreseeable, and it was deadly. The casualty numbers had become catastrophic. The commanders knew it. The pilots knew it. But official procedures were official procedures, and creative thinking was frowned upon. The killing had settled into a terrible routine, and nobody seemed able to break it. Then one pilot from South Africa began flying in ways nobody had ever shown him. Rather than turning to match the enemy's movements, rather than climbing for the altitude advantage, he would drop straight through the combat zone at velocities that seemed physically impossible. He turned gravity into his greatest asset and treated raw speed as his shield. And somehow, he kept coming back alive. After his first such attack, his commanding officer gave him a formal reprimand for dangerous flying. After the second time, he was taken aside and lectured about proper aerial combat fundamentals. After the third time, he simply stopped listening to the lectures entirely and went right back up to do it again. His name was Squadron Leader Marmaduke Thomas St. John Pattle. His friends called him Pat. He spoke quietly, had the sturdy frame of someone who had worked farmland, and possessed an almost supernatural understanding of how machines behaved. He never debated with his superiors about tactics. He just kept diving. Pat came into the world in 1914 in South Africa's Orange Free State, a place defined by red dirt and horizons that seemed to stretch forever. His father worked as a mining engineer. His mother raised him with strict expectations and few words. The family had no money for theatrics and no tolerance for wastefulness. You put your head down, solved whatever problems came your way, and moved forward. He taught himself to fly in Johannesburg on rickety biplanes that were barely held together with wire and optimism. He flew solo after just 7 hours of instruction. His teachers noticed that his hands stayed rock steady and his choices came lightning fast. He never hesitated or panicked. He handled an airplane the way most men handled an automobile. In 1936, he enlisted in the Royal Air Force through a short-term service arrangement. He was stationed in England first, then Egypt, then Greece. He mastered Gladiators, then Hurricanes, then Spitfires. Each time he switched to a new aircraft, he adapted like a skilled craftsman, picking up an unfamiliar tool. No fuss, no complaints. His flight records from those years were unremarkable. Neat handwriting, standard patrols, nothing flashy. But the mechanics who maintained his planes noticed something unusual. After every flight, he would walk slowly around his aircraft, letting his fingertips trace along the body, examining the control surfaces, asking specific questions. Not about whether anything was broken, but about how everything had responded. What did the ailerons feel like when he pushed the speed? Did the rudder shake during steep descents? Was there any looseness in the elevator controls? He was not simply checking for damage. He was studying his machine's personality. His head mechanic would later say that Pat communicated with his aircraft the way a rancher communicates with a horse, not through language, but through careful attention. By 1941, he was flying combat operations above the Mediterranean Sea. His victory count increased steadily but quietly. He made no exaggerated claims and performed no theatrical victory spins. He fired in short, precise bursts from close range and wasted no bullets. He would return to base with holes punched through his wings and never mention them. Fellow pilots respected his unshakable composure. He never boasted about kills. He never froze in dangerous moments. He had developed the kind of inner stillness that only comes from solving three-dimensional puzzles while someone is actively trying to end your life. But what truly distinguished him was his unconventional diving technique. While other pilots climbed into circular dogfights, Pat would position himself at high altitude, select a victim, and then plummet like a hunting falcon. He would tear through the chaotic tangle of planes at the edge of his aircraft's structural limits, squeeze off a 2-second volley of gunfire, and then rocket back upward on pure momentum before any enemy could even get him in their sights. To observers, it looked insane. It looked like a death wish. But it worked. The veteran pilots mockingly called it the caveman method. All brute force, they said, no sophistication. They ridiculed it over drinks in the officers' club. They argued it ignored every principle of energy conservation, battlefield awareness, and coordinated teamwork. Pat listened politely, nodded his understanding, and continued diving. He had grasped something that eluded everyone else. During aerial combat, time itself seems to compress. The pilot who completes his mental calculation and executes fastest is the pilot who survives. Turning battles stretch that decision-making process out. They become exhausting contests of fuel reserves and patience. But a diving attack eliminates all of that completely. You observe, you decide, you act. There is no opportunity for doubt, and there is no effective counter. An enemy plane climbing into a banking turn follows a predictable arc. An enemy plane dropping at maximum velocity presents a problem with no answer. You cannot turn faster than the pull of gravity. You cannot climb faster than pure falling momentum. Pat never published tactical analysis papers or gave academic lectures. But through pure instinct and constant practice, he had discovered a fundamental truth that would eventually become standard military teaching. Velocity equals survival. Height equals stored power. And whoever attacks first while disappearing before the enemy responds holds all the cards. The air war over France had turned into a bloodbath. Fighter command was losing seasoned pilots more quickly than new ones could be prepared. The Germans had refined their methods into ruthless efficiency. They flew in pairs at staggered heights with patience and coordination. When the British showed up, they simply waited, let the Spitfires commit to an attack, then struck from above. British squadrons still flew the outdated formations, groups of 3 in tight parade ground spacing. It looked impressive. It was catastrophic in actual battle. The wingmen spent so much effort avoiding mid-air collisions with their own leader that they had no attention left for spotting threats. The Germans had learned to disregard the formation entirely and simply pick off the exposed aircraft on the edges, one by one, like predators thinning a herd. The high command understood the tactics were failing. Identical reports arrived from every squadron telling identical stories of identical losses. But altering doctrine demanded meetings and testing and sign-offs, and nobody had that kind of time. So young men continued dying in entirely avoidable ways. Pat observed all of this from his cockpit and from the post-mission debriefings. He recognized the pattern, the hesitation, the blind obedience to regulations that no longer reflected reality. He watched inexperienced pilots paralyzed by procedure, waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to stay alive. He attempted to explain his approach to his squadron commander. He described how the diving assault created energy superiority, delivered psychological shock, and made retaliation essentially impossible. He sketched diagrams on the ready room blackboard using mathematics, geometry, and plain common sense. The commander listened courteously, then reminded Pat that aerial warfare was a team endeavor requiring coordination and mutual protection. Abandoning your wingman to dive into enemy formations without support was not tactical thinking. It was rolling the dice. Pat said nothing in response. He had realized that certain people put their faith in lived experience while others put their faith in established systems. He also understood that when those two philosophies collided, systems won the argument in the conference room, but experience won the battle in the sky. So he quit trying to persuade anyone and simply continued flying his own way. His confirmed kills continued climbing. By April, he had shot down more enemy aircraft than anyone else in his squadron. By May, he ranked among the highest-scoring Allied pilots in the entire region. The numbers were too significant to dismiss, yet his methods remained hotly debated. Some younger pilots began copying him. The ones who had witnessed too many comrades spiral burning into the English Channel started experimenting with diving attacks of their own. Some of them survived, some did not. The technique demanded sound judgment, iron nerves, and deep familiarity with exactly how far you could push your aircraft before it broke apart. This was not something you could master in a lecture hall. The skeptics among the older generation remained unconvinced. They highlighted the failures while ignoring the successes. They claimed Pat was simply blessed with unusual luck, that his approach only worked because he possessed extraordinary abilities, and that typical pilots attempting the same thing would merely accelerate their own deaths. This criticism contained a grain of truth. Pat was far from typical, but the objection missed a crucial point. The conventional tactics were not saving average pilots either. They were just dying in a way that met official approval. The situation reached a breaking point as May drew to a close. Intelligence sources reported that the German Air Force was assembling a massive fighter operation over the Pas-de-Calais, a large-scale aerial sweep intended to draw out the RAF and systematically destroy it. British command chose to confront the threat directly. Every squadron that could fly was scrambled. Pat's unit was part of the response force. They lifted off early in the afternoon, climbing into skies already crisscrossed with vapor trails and filled with radio chatter. The mission briefing was uncomplicated. Find the enemy, engage him, shield our bombers, and try to make it home. The Germans, however, were ready and waiting, and they had brought everything they had. The two forces collided at 22,000 feet. Pat spotted them before anyone else. A massive swarm of Messerschmitt 109s layered at different altitudes, drifting slowly, waiting for the British to make the first move. Lurking below them, a second wave of heavier, faster Focke-Wulf 190s held in reserve. It was an ambush wrapped in the appearance of an opportunity. His commander ordered the textbook response, "Ascend, attack the higher fighters, hold formation." Pat knew exactly what would happen if they followed those orders. The 109s would begin their turning dance. The 19s would plunge downward. His entire squadron would be torn to pieces in the resulting chaos. He made his choice in an instant. He did not request authorization. He separated from the formation, pushed his control stick forward, and dove. The Spitfire gained speed like a falling boulder. The entire airframe vibrated. The engine howled. The altimeter needle spun downward almost too fast to track. He was subjecting the plane to forces that the manufacturer explicitly warned would cause structural failure. The wings bent visibly. The controls grew heavy and resistant. He held the dive anyway. Behind him, his squadron commander was screaming over the radio, demanding he rejoin the formation, threatening consequences. Pat did not reply. His entire focus was on geometry and calculation. He was diving toward the lower formation of 19s. They had not detected him yet. Their attention was fixed upward, anticipating the bomber escorts descending into range. Pat was approaching from above and behind, outside their peripheral vision, traveling faster than their expectations. He closed the distance. 300 yards, then 200, then 100. He chose a target, a 190 positioned on the left edge of the group, slightly separated from the others. He centered his gun sight, pressed the trigger. The burst lasted 2 seconds. cannon rounds and machine gun bullets. The 190 shook violently, rolled upside down, and tumbled away with smoke pouring from its engine. No dramatic explosion, just immediate, devastating damage. The surrounding Germans scrambled to respond, but their reactions were already too late. Pat had already blown through their entire formation and vanished below before a single one could train weapons on him. He leveled off at 12,000 feet, bleeding speed rapidly but very much alive. He looked up. The sky above had dissolved into a swirling confusion of turning, diving fighters. His squadron was engaged everywhere, scattered and separated. The organized battle had collapsed into pure pandemonium. He was alone, exactly where he functioned best. He started climbing again, not straight up but at a careful angle, rebuilding his energy reserves, scanning constantly. The German fighters above were consumed by the main engagement. None of them noticed the solitary Spitfire clawing its way back up through the maelstrom. Pat spotted a 109 pursuing one of his squadron mates. The British plane was banking desperately, trying to shake its hunter. It was a losing effort. The 109 pilot was patient, gradually tightening his angle, setting up the killing shot. Pat dove again, more shallowly this time, a slicing attack from the side. He opened fire from longer distance, watching his tracer rounds walk across the 109's fuselage. The German aborted his pursuit and rolled away. Pat did not chase. He was already hunting for the next opportunity. The subsequent 4 minutes defied every reasonable expectation of staying alive. Pat refused to engage in traditional dogfighting. He never tried to outturn anyone. He climbed, he dropped, he climbed again. He used the vertical dimension like rungs on a ladder, exchanging altitude for velocity, velocity for position, position for destruction. Every attack was a thunderbolt. Fire, break away, never linger, never give second opportunities. He was pushing his aircraft beyond its intended capabilities. The wings were flexing dangerously. Rivets strained against their holes. The control surfaces flirted with the threshold of aerodynamic flutter. He could sense it through the stick, a faint tremor, a mechanical warning. He disregarded it. He noticed a pair of 109s scissoring back and forth with a lone Hurricane. The Hurricane had exhausted its options. Pat dropped onto the trailing 109, fired, and destroyed its tail section. The second 109 pulled sharply upward. Pat followed the climbing brake, firing while inverted, and stitched rounds through the cockpit canopy. The German plane snapped into an uncontrolled spin. 3 confirmed kills. 3 dives. He was beginning to draw notice. The German pilots realized that a lone Spitfire was hunting them from high above. They began looking skyward, but looking skyward cost them concentration on the main battle. Without meaning to, Pat was disrupting the rhythm of the entire engagement. He climbed once more. His fuel gauge was dropping. His ammunition was half depleted. His engine temperature was creeping into dangerous territory. Logic demanded he break off, dive for home, live to fight another day. He stayed. He saw a 190 lining up on a wounded Spitfire that was barely maintaining flight, trailing thick smoke. One more burst of gunfire would finish it. Pat dove. The approach angle was terrible. The closing speed was suicidal. He squeezed the trigger anyway. The 190 detonated. The crippled Spitfire limped away toward England. 4 kills. He hauled back on the stick. The gravitational forces flattened him against his seat. His peripheral vision collapsed. Gray shadows crept inward from the edges. He relaxed his pull slightly, allowed blood to return to his brain, and kept ascending. Another 109. Another plunge. Another 2-second volley. The Messerschmitt flipped onto its back and fell away, engine silent. 5 kills. The aerial battlefield was thinning. Surviving German pilots were disengaging. They had lost their coordination, lost their momentum. They were no longer predators. They were prey trying to escape. Pat spotted a 190 attempting to flee, diving for the ground. He pursued at full power. His Spitfire was shuddering, protesting, threatening to shake itself into pieces. The wings shrieked with stress. He closed to point-blank distance and fired. The 190 came apart in midair. 6 kills. He pulled up at 3,000 feet. His eyesight was fuzzy from the crushing forces. His muscles burned with fatigue. His fuel indicator was bouncing against empty. He should leave immediately. Instead, he saw two more 109s trying to regroup, attempting to restore some order to the chaos. He turned toward them. They watched him coming. They executed a defensive split, one climbing, one descending. The classic countermove, designed to force an attacker to choose one target and surrender the other. Pat refused to choose. He dove between the two, firing at the lower 109 during his descent, scoring hits. The German veered away, leaking coolant. Pat yanked back into a steep climb, met the higher 109 head-on, and fired in a crossing pass. That one banked left, pouring smoke. 7 kills, confirmed or seriously damaged. The distinction was becoming irrelevant. He had exhausted his altitude, his velocity, his tactical options. His engine was dangerously overheated. The oil pressure indicator flickered ominously. The cockpit smelled of scorching metal. Then he saw them. 2 190s, close and closing fast. They had identified him. They knew he was vulnerable. They were coming for the kill. Pat did the only thing available to him. He dove one more time. His Spitfire was past every limit. The airframe groaned in protest. The wings bent in ways wings were never meant to bend. The dive was nearly straight down. The airspeed indicator needle disappeared past the maximum marking. He was falling faster than any pilot could control, faster than the pursuing 19s dared to follow. He started his pullout at 500 feet above the ground. The gravitational forces were crushing. His vision went completely black. The control stick felt like it was carved from granite. The Spitfire groaned, shuddered, and finally leveled out. The wings remained attached. Barely. He checked behind him. The 190s had vanished. Either they lost track of him in the dive or assumed he had crashed into the earth. He was alone, low, slow, and still breathing. He pointed his aircraft toward home. On the journey back, he came across a solitary 109 limping toward France, engine smoking, probably out of ammunition. An easy target. Pat had exactly 3 rounds remaining in a single gun. He moved in close, pressed the trigger. The 109 shuddered and nosed over into the English Channel. 8 kills. He crossed the coastline. His fuel gauge showed nothing at all. His engine was choking and sputtering. He glided the final 5 miles to the airfield, touched down on fumes, and taxied to the parking area. The ground crew rushed to meet him. They saw the empty ammunition containers, the heat-damaged engine. The wings curved slightly upward from the extreme forces he had subjected them to. They asked how many enemy planes he had destroyed. He held up 8 fingers. Then he stopped, thought about it, and corrected himself. 9. He had forgotten the first one. 9 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission. 1 pilot, 1 airplane. 4 minutes of unbroken combat at the absolute boundaries of physical endurance and mechanical tolerance. It set the RAF record for the most kills in a single sortie up to that point in the war, and he had achieved it using tactics that were officially discouraged. His squadron commander did not discipline him. He did not offer congratulations either. He simply stared for a long moment. Then he asked Pat to walk through, step by step, exactly what he had done. There were no official announcements, no celebrations, just conversation spreading from one ready room to the next. Pat's approach was analyzed and dissected across fighter command. Pilots who had survived the same engagement described what they had witnessed. A lone Spitfire dropping again and again, materializing and disappearing, shredding the German formation from within. It was not foolhardiness, it was precision. Within weeks, instructors at the training facilities began introducing energy-based tactics, not as official policy yet, but as an alternative approach, an additional tool. The diving attack, the zoom climb, the philosophy that would later be called boom and zoom, which would define aerial warfare for decades to come. It started with the combat veterans, men who had witnessed enough death to recognize a better path. They taught the newer pilots. They demonstrated the techniques. They made acceptable the idea that speed was a weapon, that height was stored energy, that the vertical axis was not merely space to maneuver within. It was the place from which you controlled the entire fight. German intelligence noticed the shift. Their analysts reviewed gun camera recordings and casualty reports. They observed that British pilots had stopped playing the turning game. They were striking fast, breaking away, and refusing to be suckered into extended circular battles. The loss ratios began to balance out. By summer 1942, boom and zoom techniques were being woven into squadron-level instruction throughout the RAF. Not because headquarters issued a directive, but because pilots who flew this way came home more often. Results trumped paperwork. Pat continued flying throughout this period. He did not go on publicity tours. He did not give lectures at academies. He led through personal example. His total number of aerial victories would eventually surpass 40, though the precise count remains disputed. Wartime records are imperfect. Kills were shared between pilots, obscured by confusion, lost in the chaos of battle. What cannot be disputed is his influence. He fundamentally changed how an entire generation of fighter pilots understood energy management. He demonstrated that unconventional did not mean undisciplined, and that genuine innovation often emerges from the cockpit rather than the briefing room. He would not live to see his ideas reach their full flowering. In April 1941, over the skies of Greece, his aircraft was struck during a low-altitude ground attack mission. He crashed. He was 26 years old. His death barely registered outside his own squadron. The war was too enormous, the casualty lists too long, but the tactics he pioneered outlasted him. They were polished, standardized, and taught to American aviators and Soviet aviators alike. By 1943, boom and zoom had become the standard approach for every major air force on Earth. The swirling, circling dogfights of 1940 were relics of history. The 9-kill mission became legendary. It was examined at military colleges, scrutinized in tactical publications, cited as evidence that individual initiative, when founded on solid principles, can reshape the course of combat. Fighter pilots in the Korean War employed his methods. Pilots in Vietnam did the same. The F-15, the F-16, the entire modern doctrine of air superiority, all of it traces back to the same core ideas: velocity, altitude, initiative, strike first, break contact, survive. And every one of those principles originated with a farmer's son from South Africa who refused to turn when everyone around him was turning. A faded photograph of him still exists. He stands beside a Spitfire, hands resting on his hips, gazing at something beyond the camera's frame. He is not smiling. He looks exhausted. He looks like a young man who has absorbed too much and spoken too little. Today, his name is recognized mostly by historians and aviation enthusiasts. There is no grand memorial bearing his name, no museum wing dedicated to his accomplishments. He is one of thousands of young men who climbed into cockpits, fought their battles, and died in a war that consumed an entire generation. Yet his influence permeates everything. Every fighter pilot who straps into a modern jet inherits a piece of his logic, the understanding that regulations are instruments, not sacred texts, that survival demands constant adaptation, that courage is not about feeling no fear, it is about acting decisively despite the fear. The 9-kill sortie was not a random miracle. It was the product of hundreds of hours spent mastering his machine, questioning conventional wisdom, and trusting his own instincts above official doctrine. It was the final expression of a philosophy that recognized the enemy's expectations as a weakness to exploit, and that surprise multiplies strength. In the years following the war, military theorists would formalize what Pat had understood intuitively: energy maneuverability theory, the OODA loop, John Boyd's doctrine of rapid transitions. All of it echoes the same underlying truth. The pilot who controls the tempo of combat controls its outcome. Pat never composed a training manual. He never developed formal theories. He simply flew in the manner that physics and logic told him to fly, and by doing so, he gave others permission to think for themselves. There is a lesson in that story, not merely for aviators, for anyone who confronts a system demanding rigid compliance despite mounting evidence that compliance is failing, for anyone told that survival requires following rules that no longer match the reality in front of them. Pat's true legacy is not the 9 aircraft he destroyed. It is the proof that a single person thinking with clarity under extreme pressure can transform how everyone else approaches the fight. He did not wait for permission. He did not wait for consensus. He identified a better approach, tested it under fire, proved its worth, and shared it freely. The skies over northern France are peaceful now. The vapor trails have faded. The guns have fallen silent. But the lesson endures. Speed is life. Altitude is opportunity. And the initiative belongs to those who have the courage to dive when everyone else is climbing.